Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. And for our final segment of the day here on today's show, we are going to be doing our weekly shadow report. Like I mentioned, the key wide receiver cornerback matchups of Week 12 that will define your fantasy football week and potentially some last minute decisions you might want to make. Now, we've seen a lot of these matchups this season already before because we're getting into the divisional games and the feisty nature of those. So, potentially, these are matchups we've already talked about and we want to talk about them in a different light. But also, some matchups in which I feel like either the corner has a certain advantage that I want to acknowledge, or, the wide receiver feels like they can have a different story this time around in this matchups. So without further ado, let's jump into our final segment of today's show here on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast with our weekly shadow report. Starting off with the first matchup. I actually think this is the first matchup of these two this season. Don't quote me on that, but it is going to be an exciting one because I hold both of these players in high regard, even though they've kind of been disrespected over these past couple of years and haven't really had the opportunity to prove themselves. Especially the cornerback in this situation had a pretty bad season this year, has some injury issues as well this year, but this receiver has also been someone who's now had the opportunity to play really well in a system that really works for him. And so I really think this matchup is going to be intriguing this week. And that is Terry McLaurin against Trayvon Diggs in this divisional matchup in the NFC East. And what I really think matters here is the fact that Trayvon Diggs has not had the best of seasons. He's had some injury woes, and almost everyone on the Cowboys defense has had some injury woes. And as a result, this Cowboys defense really hasn't had the opportunity to strut their stuff this season. So this matchup does seem favorable to Terry McLaurin, but I'm giving Trayvon Diggs the benefit of the doubt here as well because he still is a respected cornerback in this league. And whether or not, this Cowboys team can be competitive enough to make this a game, which I don't think they will, Trayvon Diggs can make this a frustrating matchup for Terry McLaurin. Terry McLaurin's going to want to work on the perimeter, so he may not line up against Trayvon Diggs all the time. But I still think, it's going to come down to whether or not this Commanders offense looks a little bit different than what we've seen in that really great stretch for them after the bye. As Tapton says, Dallas' weak pass rush hurts Diggs, and I agree. But to a certain extent, I feel like there's something about the Commanders' offense that I want to see in terms of kind of staying within the structure of trying to hit that big play, but also trying to be a little bit more minimalistic so as not to put too much pressure on Jalen Daniels. As Tapton says, plus Daniels can go off script. He can, which I admire in him. But I do feel like, I want to see a more composed performance from the Washington Commanders after the disasters of the past 2 weeks where you kind of saw this team, like you mentioned, had to learn a little bit off script. So I want to see, a more complete game from Jaden Daniels, and that might include, a little less of the deep shot to Terry in this game. So even though Terry seemingly has the advantage in this one, just because of the excitement of this Commanders offense, explosiveness it brings, I still have to give Diggs the benefit of the doubt here just because he's a corner who can make it tough, whether or not Dallas' pass rush gets home, which I agree could be a major factor in this game. But from the perspective of this matchup, it is an interesting one on paper at the very least. So look for it to potentially define how you decide on Terry McLaurin this week if you own him. And then for the second matchup of the day here, I feel like this one is going to be a very popular one because this one already happened, Tyreek Hill versus Christian Gonzalez this season, but under completely different circumstances. Tyreek Hill was sans Tua Tagovailoa, so Christian Gonzalez was favored in this matchup, at the very least because Tyreek Hill didn't have someone who could throw him this ball. As Tap Children says, You like Reeler to start. I'm not sure who Reeler is. I believe you're probably saying Mr. DJ Reader or Eckler to start. I feel like he could be an interesting start against the Cowboys. I think that I did actually put him in my fantasy rankings this week just because I want to see this running game get going again. It feels like they went away from it for a little bit, Washington, these past couple of weeks, and really didn't play into all of their running backs' best traits. But Austin Eckler can be very effective against this Cowboys defense, especially in stretching it horizontally in the pass game, or just by being his usual explosive self in the run game, especially on early downs as well. So I think Austin Eckler is a very viable start for this week. Getting back to this matchup again, it's made a little bit more exhilarating, a little bit more fun to watch because of the fact that Tua is now playing in it, not, Skylar Thompson or Snoop Huntley. But it is worth noting that Christian Gonzalez has faced a gauntlet of receivers. Guys like, DK Metcalf, who was the only player actually who scored a touchdown against him. Hill, a lot of weapons. Devontae Adams as well. He's faced a lot of talented receivers in this league, but only given up one touchdown. And he can line anywhere, whether it be in the perimeter or the slot. So he's not going to be afraid of this matchup just because Tua is at the QB position right now for Miami and not Skylar Thompson like last time. But it is worth noting that Christian Gonzalez has this track record and this resume, no matter who's at the quarterback position for certain teams. And so in this divisional matchup, which makes this game a little bit more tense, especially considering the fact that the Dolphins feel like they can make a little run at the playoffs here, look for Christian Gonzalez to want to shut down Tyreek Hill yet again by any means necessary. So I think that this matchup, while I think Tyreek Hill could have a decent game, don't underestimate Christian Gonzalez and his resume this season. And for the third matchup here that I wanted to address, this is one that hasn't happened a lot actually in retrospect, but still is a fun one to monitor just because I feel like this game's going to be a lot closer than people think. It's Justin Jefferson going up against Jalen Johnson in this matchup. Like I say, Jalen Johnson's shown up on this list a lot just because he's one of my favorite young corners to talk about. But this is a matchup, right, where out of all these divisional games, this one's going under the radar a little bit. But these are two teams that play starkly similarly, not necessarily completely similarly, but I do feel like that plays into Jalen Johnson's hands a little bit more than you think. Because when I look at the worst units here for both teams, the offenses, I feel like Sam Darnold has started to regress a little bit. And perhaps as a result, not necessarily try and open up down the field to Justin Jefferson as much as he did to start the season. So I'm not necessarily saying that I'm immediately indicting this offense, but I do want that to kind of stick in people's minds because this Bears secondary and defense as a whole is very competitive. And this Vikings offense has not looked like it's looked for a large portion of the season these past couple of weeks against defenses that, are elite in nature, but still should have been beaten a little bit more handily by Minnesota. So this matchup just is made more interesting due to the fact that this Vikings offense feels like it should win a lot of matchups here and can dominate this game because of what I've seen from them. Could be a little bit more tense, especially because it, as again, is a divisional contest. All of these divisional matchups, all these wide receiver cornerback matchups that have happened so many times over and over, just becomes a kind of repetition for all these players to face each other. And that could play into some of these corners' hands here and really make you think about who to roster for your fantasy squad at the receiver position. But now I want to talk about perhaps the most intriguing matchup I picked, because this is a guy who I've chosen against a whole secondary really, because this is a wide receiver core that I can't really pin down or gauge. So I have to pick, one guy who I want to pinpoint here. And I don't really know how it's going to affect this secondary based off of the many other weapons in his offense surrounding him. But Jayden Reed going up against a 49ers secondary that I really think hasn't been as elite as people think or expected this season, especially with all the injuries to them. Hufanga and Ward sitting out for large portions of the season. Not even fully healthy, I think, in the back end as well. A lot of losses as well this season. I feel like Jayden Reed, this is his opportunity to step up and assume the mantle of wide receiver one for the Packers. I feel like a lot of people are growing frustrated with how to view Packers receivers from a fantasy perspective because of the depth there. But I feel like this game can be the game where Jayden Reed really steps up. And not for nothing, the reason why I said the 49ers secondary as a whole is because they've really been the most underwhelming unit in the entire National Football League, based off what we thought the way we were going to be coming into the season to now. And I can't necessarily completely blame the coaching here. I can blame the injury bug a little bit more as well. But it's something that I have noticed. And so Jayden Reed, even though he's not necessarily viewed as the wide receiver one by many people in the fantasy football landscape, or maybe even by Packers fans, he still is someone who I have to take into account as someone who can affect games, whether or not, secondaries really hone in on him and try and focus on beating the whole of the Packers instead of just one individual. So that's why this matchup is so interesting. But let me know what you think in the comments, because this will just about do it for today's show. This has been the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. My name has been Christopher Shepard. Thank you all for tuning in. We'll be back tomorrow at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Consider liking, following, and subscribing to the show and the network as a whole, or continue making yourselves available to the many ways you can contribute and interact with the show with YouTube. But other than that, like I said, we'll be back as always tomorrow, but I am out for today.